Or Parker says we're ready anyway. All right. Thanks for being here this morning. I know that it was probably really hard to resist when Randall said that the class on Deuteronomy was going to keep going. That everybody went, oh, wow, and there's something else we could do. But actually, we're moving right along through the book. We're taking it, if you haven't been here, we're taking it in really kind of bigger sections. And I was taking a look at the calendar last week, and we're not all that far away from finishing it up. I think the middle of November we finish through the book of Deuteronomy. Hopefully that we've found that there's some stuff in here for us to look at. I know there's some things that are confusing and repetitive, but I think there are some good things that we can pull away from it. This morning we're going to be looking at chapters 20 through 22. This is still part of Moses' second big speech. This will be the longest one. The first one is just a few chapters long in the beginning, and then there's this one that lasts, I believe, through chapter 26, and then the final one will be Moses' farewell as they get ready to move on into Canaan. The Israel is there at the border. They're camped along the Jordan. They can see where they're heading, and we've talked about this being a future-oriented book, right? Of Moses saying over and over, it's when you get into the land, when you come into the land, because this is going to happen soon. They're getting ready to make the move across, but it's also a time for Israel to make their decision of what they're going to do and how they're going to be today, right? Today, you make these decisions, and we'll see that more and more as we go through there. So 20 through 22 today, there's an interesting thing I came across several years back, that if you took a section of Scripture and what you would do would be to ask somebody, ask the people that you were talking with to describe it and only use one word. And so I was trying to do that a little bit with these chapters today, and if I was going to do that, there's a lot of different ways I think we could go, but one of the things that the word that I think I would use to describe this is different. Okay? And so let's jump into that, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in just a second. So chapter 20, and let's just start verse 1. When you go out to war against your enemies, and you see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. When you draw near to the battle, the priest shall come forward, speak to the people, and shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are drawing near for battle against your enemies. Let not your heart faint. Do not fear or panic or be in dread of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you the victory. Then the officers shall speak to the people, saying, Is there any man who's built a new house and not dedicated it? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in battle and another man dedicate it. And is there any man who has planted a vineyard and has not enjoyed its fruit? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in battle and another man enjoy its fruit. Is there any man who has betrothed a wife and has not taken her? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in battle and another man take her. And the officers will speak further to the people and say, Is there any man who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house, lest he make the heart of his fellows melt like his own. When the officers have finished speaking to the people, when the commanders shall be appointed, and then the commanders will be appointed at the head of the people. All right, so the very first thing that we see here, I hope that we see here, is the idea of Israel is going to be the underdog. All right? As we think about Israel, maybe I'm the only one guilty of this. When we think about Israel, we think of a lot of people, right? Because there seems to be a great multitude of them that come out of Egypt, and that they're going to just come in and overwhelm the land. But Israel is really a very small nation compared to everyone else around them. And not only that, they're not equipped or trained as a military. For now a little over 440 years, somewhere in that neighborhood, they've been either slaves or wanderers. And they're not necessarily battle tested and have a large military force trained. And so they are going to be the underdog. And so God says, when you go out to war against your enemies, it's not like if you see that the other side's bigger. It's almost like you're going to see that they have chariots, and they have horses, and they have soldiers, and they are trained, and they're ready. Don't worry about it. What God has hopefully tried to show them over the past, well, at least the past 40 years, is that He is the one providing, He is the one supporting, and He is the one that's going to give them victory. If we kind of think back just a little bit as to where they've been, 40 years prior, they were at the border of Canaan, and they didn't want to go in, right? They went in, they spied the land, and they came back out, and they said, no, they're too great for us to conquer. And then God said, fine, they said, well, would that we had just died in the wilderness. And God said, okay, then that's the way it'll be, right? So that generation is going to die in the wilderness. But after they see the trouble, oh, sorry, I was going to start singing. Okay. Okay. Anyway, after they realize what God has done and said that you're not going to take the land, then they go ahead and try anyway, right? There's a group of them that say, we're going to go ahead and try to go in anyway. And they're soundly defeated and run off. And then later, as they come back, God defeats those same enemies again. So He's going to remind them, you don't need to worry. Don't be faint-hearted. Don't be scared. God's got you. Okay? I hope we hear that, and I hope that we hear that now. God's got you. Don't worry. Don't be faint-hearted. Don't worry that you seem to be the minority. I don't follow this a lot, and there's probably people who follow it a lot more closely than I do. This idea of our politics right now. And like I say, I don't follow much of it, but I realize I hear a lot, and it's kind of hard to avoid, unless you want to go out and just live by yourself, with no access to anything. You're going to hear about it. And I hear a lot of people, and I read a lot of things that come across, in different platforms, and it seems like there's a lot of anxiousness. And some for good reason, I think. But there's also a lot of anxiousness that I see from people who are Christian people, right? I'm going, what are we going to do? Is the right person going to be in office? Is the right person going to be in our local office? Are we going to, how's the direction, how's the wind blowing here? What's the direction that the country's taking, and what's that going to mean for us? And there's some anxiousness. And I think there's some fear there. And I hope that as we look at this little section in Deuteronomy chapter 20, we hear God going, don't fear. Yes, you are the minority. For hundreds of years, or close to hundreds, I guess, but for quite a while, at least here in our nation, it's not been that way. It seems that Christians, of all stripes, but people who would identify as the people of God, people that follow Jesus, have been kind of in the majority, right? For several generations. And now that we see that, and if we look at data and you look at this and it looks like things are shrinking in the other way, we get a little anxious and we get a little scared. What does this mean? Does this mean that our way of life that we've known, the way that we've been able to go about our conduct and our religious practices, are they going to be under fire now? What are we going to do? I'm not one of those people that just go, just whatever will be, right? I think that we have some responsibility of our own to see what's going on around us and to be aware of the culture around us. But I also think that at the same time I'm going, just let's let God do it. As I think about Israel being the minority here, right, and a small minority, and it's not that they don't recognize this, and it's not that like they've not been told this. You know, God told them this at Sinai. I chose you out of all of the other nations, as small as you are, and the whole earth is mine. But I've picked you. Right? That they see this, and they go, they're going to it's going to worry them. But of God saying, "Don't worry, I've got it." Many generations from the writing of this, long way down the road, there's going to be a group of people in the area of the Roman province of Asia that are going to be under a lot of fire, a lot of attack. The 7 churches that are in Asia that John writes to in the book of Revelation, and it's the same message. When he says he looks around, when you look around and this is what you see here, and you see all of this, all of the things that seem to be lined up against you, John says, and then God opens the curtain for me for a little bit, and you see that God's still there, and he's still on the throne, and he says, "I've got you." Right? So I hope that we take that with us. And again, this is we haven't quite got to the section that I was talking about when I said different is how I would describe this chapter. But this is one of those spots I want us to stop and just kind of encourage one another with that. The second, let's read on. But here you go. When you draw near to a city to fight against it and offer terms of peace, and it responds peaceably and opens to you, then the people who are found in it will do forced labor for you and will serve you. But if it makes no peace with you, but makes war against you, then you'll besiege it. The Lord your God gives it into your hand, and when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall put all its males to the sword, but all the women and little ones, the livestock, everything else in the city, all its spoil you will take as plunder for yourselves. And you will enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Thus you're to do to all the cities that are far from you, which are not cities of the nations here. But in the cities of the people that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites, the Amorites, Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they've done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. When you besiege a city, making war against it in order to take it, you will not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them. You may eat from them, but you shall not cut them down. Are the trees in the field human, that they should be besieged by you? Only the trees that you know are not trees for food you can destroy and cut down, that you can build siege works against the city that makes war with you until it falls. Okay, we have two different sections in mind here, 2 different time frames that God's dealing with. The first one is after you're settled and you go to make war, and we say you go to make war. I hope we haven't missed this. I don't think that there's much chance that we have, but this section of the world is one that's still fought over today, right? This little area of the world. At the time that Israel's going to go in, this is the crossroads. This is the way to get from Africa on into Asia. Right? This is right where it's at. They don't have the means to cross the desert to get there. So everything comes from the north and comes through that section. And so it's fought over to be held. And so this goes on and on and on. It's still fought over today. So I think that what we're seeing here is God understanding that this is going to continue, right? That this is going to continue. So when you're settled, and these are the rules for war when you're settled, right? But until you're settled, it's different. God says when you go in to Canaan, it's not going to be where you only kill the males and keep everything else. When you go in, when God gives you the city, you take it all. Everything's done. And I know, I know I struggle with that, and I don't know how many other people do, but I do. Right? It's a difficult thing for me. But I don't ever remember God saying I needed to feel okay, right? I just needed to follow. But still, it's uncomfortable for me to think of God saying, okay, when you go in, I want everything gone, right? I want men, women, children, livestock, everything gone. That seems harsh. But I also see the purpose, because he tells them right there, so that they do not teach you to do what they've been doing, so that you don't fall into that. They're called to be God's special people, God's kingdom of priests, to introduce the nations around them to the God who saved them. And they can't do that if they're going to be mixed in with them. All right? The other little thing that I thought was interesting, and again, it's just one of those little things, of when you do go in and you're going to siege a town, that God's care for his creation is in mind. You don't cut down the trees. You don't cut down the trees that are going to bear fruit. If they're not for food, you can cut them and use them. But the others don't. And I love what he says here. Are these trees people? That you should besiege them. I know it's a contentious issue in different places around the country today, but I can't help but read these first 5 books especially, and then later on also through there about God wanting us to take care of what he's given us. Even down to our environment. That we're supposed to take care of it, what it is that God has created, because God loves it. Right? God loves this creation and has pronounced it good, functioning, doing the way it's supposed to whenever he created it. And part of the job of humanity in creation was to take care of it. To this point of being different. This is one of those sections in Deuteronomy that reminds us that Israel's to be different than the people around them. Many of the conquering nations that would come out, that have come to this point, I'm certain, and that will come later, one of the things that they did when it came to sieging a town would be to cut down all the food trees, destroy vineyards, destroy crops, everything, to make it harder on those people. Right? But God with Israel says, you don't do things this way. This is how you do them. And we're going to see more of that as we get into the next chapters, if I don't get too far behind and we miss it. So anyway, so that's kind of sets it up, right? He's given them rules for warfare. The other thing that I did want to point out in the first section that I missed, and I had it written down here and I just skipped over it, was noticing the exceptions for those who went to war. Right? If you followed along previous to this in the book of Numbers, every male is counted from 20 years old and up that's able to go to war, and so there's a number fixed to this is the army. But when you get ready to go out, not everybody has to go. Right? If you've built a house but have not yet dedicated it, then stay home and dedicate it. If you've been betrothed, if you're betrothed to a wife, not yet married, you go take care of that first. You got a vineyard that you've planted that you haven't harvested any fruit from, and if I'm not mistaken, it's a 3 to 5 year process on the vineyards and the olive groves before they bear fruit. You make sure that you stay there until it does what it's supposed to do. You're excused from this. God's got it. You go take care of this. And then the other one that really got me was, and if you're just that scared, right? If you're just that faint-hearted, stay home. And God's reason for that is because I don't want that to infect everybody else. Right? Just go back. There's one more we haven't got to in this section that's not found in this section. I think it's in Deuteronomy 24. And that is if you are married, if you have just married, you are excused from military service for 1 year so that you stay home with your wife and the marriage start the way it's supposed to before you're called out. And we see God's emphasis on family, on the well-being of Israel, right? All through this. And it just amazes me, really, and it continually amazes me, just the way that God says, I've got this. I don't want to get too far off, or we're going to lose it. But I do want to mention this because I think it's a good illustration of it. It's in, I'm pretty sure it's in 1 Samuel, when Israel is going to go to war against the Philistines. And they go to war against the Philistines, and the two sons of Eli take the Ark of the Covenant with them to battle. And the idea seems to be that this is God, right? So if we take God with us, we can't lose. Well, they lose, and the Ark gets captured. Both those sons die. Eli dies when he hears the news, and the Ark is taken and put in the temple of the Philistine gods as just kind of a display of this is what we've done. They leave it there, and when they come back the next day, their statue of, I believe it's Dagon, their god, is laying down face first. There's been nobody else there. He's laying down face first before the altar, or before the ark. They stand him back up. The next day when he comes back, he's down again, hands severed and head severed. And they send the ark back. Okay? They find a way to get the ark back to Israel because they don't want it there anymore. And I think one of the points of that whole story is that God did not need Israel to beat the Philistines, that he could do it without them. He didn't need Israel's army to defeat the Philistines and defeat their God. He did it on his own. It's one of those things I hope that humbles us a little bit to understand that God doesn't need me to do what he has planned. He'll accomplish his plans. But the humbling and I guess flattering, maybe the right word for that, is that he's asked me, that he's asked us to join in. That he says, I want you to come along to win with me. I don't have to have you, but I want you. And so I think that's one of the things he's telling Israel. All right, let's get to 21 before we run completely out of time and don't even get close to the next one. The next little section is about what happens if there's a murder and you don't know who did it. Okay? I know chapter 19, Parker covered last week, talked about murders and the cities of refuge and how some of that worked. This is after you come into the land and all of a sudden you find someone who has been murdered, right? One of the Israelites has been murdered and nobody knows who did it. That doesn't mean that it's fine. There's something else that needs to happen. And so what they do, it's pretty elaborate really, is they the elders of the cities nearest where the body's found get together and they measure, right? So whichever city is closest has to deal with it. And they deal with it by they take a heifer that's never plowed, never been under a yoke, right? They bring her down to a valley that's not been plowed where there's running water and they break her neck as a sacrifice. The elders of the city wash their hands over the heifer. They go, we did not do this. We're innocent of this, but however, atonement still needs to be made because it's still serious. There's still been a life lost, and life is important to God. And so something has to be done. Then we move into another one of the places that I find incredibly uncomfortable, but that's okay. When you go out to war, we're back on war again. When you go out to war against your enemies and the Lord your God gives them into your hand and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails, She shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house and lament for her father and mother for a full month. After that, you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants. You shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. Well, I think we talked about this early on. If we didn't, it's a first. And that is that we look at these Old Testament passages and we look and see what goes on in the culture around, and sometimes we go, that's just wrong, right? I think about, Israel going in and they kill all the males, but they keep the women and the children, and they're somehow spoils of war, and an Israelite man can take one of these as his wife, and doesn't seem to be any consent there. I mean, she's going to be his wife. And we go, that seems really, really uncomfortable to me. It's also not necessarily fair that we judge what's going on in the ancient Near East by the standards we have today. That makes sense? We can't hold somebody, it's hard for us to hold Israel accountable when we think about the standards that we have today, about this just being just completely wrong. There's a cultural component to this. And as odd as this may sound, this is actually favorable, what God's doing here. In the other nations around Israel, this is not the way it's done. Right? If she is a captive, she is a captive, and she can be raped, abused, whatever. She's not part of them. It doesn't matter. But there's parameters that God sets up here. Right? First, if you see her, and this is the one you want to be your wife, then you take her to your house. But no contact, right, for a month. She used to shave her head. Now, I've looked at several different things, and I'll tell you honestly, there's lots of stuff in Deuteronomy when we start looking at this, going, I don't know why. And, it's hard for us to know why. One of the things that has been mentioned is that this has to do with a renouncing of her religion before, of whatever religion that she was before. But she was to shave her head and pare her nails. Does also seem to be significant somehow or another. But she's allowed to mourn for the loss of her family for a month. Right? And then, and only then, can you be her husband? Can you take her to be your own? And not just that, if this is what you want, she's yours. If she no longer pleases you, and we'll get to sections about divorce a little bit later, but if she no longer pleases you, then she goes free wherever she wants. You don't sell her. She's not yours. You're not going to profit on this. You're not going to use her and sell her as a slave. There's going to be dignity attached to this woman, but she's yours and you cannot profit from it. Again, different. It's hard for us to look at this and go, yeah, that's the way it ought to be, because it seems really, really, there's some really ugly things that we run into. But of going, this is different than the people around you. You're not going to be like them, because they wouldn't do it this way. It keeps on going the same way. It talks about the firstborn. We're going to talk about in the next section of if a man has two wives, loves one, doesn't love the other one, but the unloved one is the one who gives birth to the firstborn. He can't mistreat the firstborn just because he doesn't belong to the wife he loves. The firstborn is the firstborn, and he gets the inheritance rights of more than the others. God has this connection with the firstborn in some places, and in some places it seems like he doesn't, right? But there's places where God has this connection with the firstborn. It's back years before, not all that many years, but years before this is read, or this is spoken by Moses, where that's how God refers to Israel. He tells Moses when he goes back to Pharaoh, you tell him, Israel is my firstborn son. Right? Israel's my firstborn son. And if you don't release him, I'll kill your firstborn son. Right? So this is the connection. The firstborn is to be given to God. Firstborn from the herds, firstborn from the flocks, firstborn of the people, to be given to God. And you don't kill your firstborn son, but you offer something in place of him, because the firstborn has a special place. Then we get to, I don't know, some of you may think this is a great part. There's been times that I've thought it was. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, will not listen to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him, bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives, and they shall say to the elders of the city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city will stone him to death with stones, and you will purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear. I've never shown up at the elder's house with one of my boys going, all right, get rid of him. No, he won't listen, right? But this seems to be a big deal. This seems to be huge. If you have a rebellious son that you've instructed and you've warned, he won't listen to either parent, and he continues on, and he's a glutton, and he's a drunkard, and whatever this is, and he refuses to do that, you're to take him and say, this is what we've tried, this is where we are, and they'll stone him to death. And to purge the evil from among you. Again, seems a little harsh, but we also need to we kind of understand God's forming a community, a nation, and that nation to be holy. And one of the commandments, again, all these are just expanding the 10 commandments, is honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you, and you can live long in the land that the Lord your God has given you. That kind of respect and obedience is first learned with the parents. Parents have a huge responsibility, and I'm not here, please don't get this wrong. I had a guy tell me one time, if you really want to strike guilt in your audience in the church, just start talking about parenting, because there's not a Christian parent that won't feel guilty, right? And that's not what I'm trying to do here. But what I am trying to say is what God seems to be recognizing here is that there's a huge responsibility on parents, and they're not left on their own. It's not just left just to them to have to deal with. That as the community, they help. And they help deal with one another, because it's not individual salvation. Right? This is a salvation of a nation and a redemption of a nation and a people who are supposed to be a certain way. And this kind of thing is learned to begin with in the house. Right? I mean, we can go back just a few chapters if we want to, but most of us probably already know it. The Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And then the commandments that I give you today are to be on your heart. Right? Write them on the doorpost and the lintels of your houses, on your gates. You will teach them diligently to your children. You will talk about them when you sit down, when you get up, when you walk by the way. Right? These are, and over, he says, when your children ask you, this is what you tell them. And I think I don't know that there's ever any, I can't recall any off the top of my head, any record of this happening in Israel, right? Of them actually stoning a child to death because of this, but of God really illustrating the seriousness of this. Because it's going to be just a little while longer, just about 2 generations, I think, away, maybe 3, where they're actually in the promised land. I think it's in Judges chapter 2. Where it says that Israel follows the ways that follows the covenant of God, then arises a generation that does not. Right? And they fall away, and this is where it begins the cycle that we see in the Judges. Right? So we see the importance of it. Am I running out? I'm going to run out of time. Okay. The final one is another one where I think difference comes into play. a man committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body will not remain on the tree, but you will bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. I'm going to, again, I'm just going to be honest. I'm by no means an expert in Old Testament law, but I've had a hard time thinking of a time where God says for punishment that hanging is part of it. Or really what I think what we're looking at here is not necessarily hanging the way we think of it, as in a rope. I think this is more of an impaling thing, more like crucifixion. And I don't see that really as being a punishment that God prescribes. There's of course there's stoning. There's to be cut off from the people. There is one that you will burn with fire. I remember that from back in I believe that's back in Leviticus. But this one. One of the practices of some of the nations around Israel, and some of the ones that will come later, really one that springs to mind is the Assyrians. This was done as a matter of practice for them. If they conquered a nation and they hung people, they impaled people on trees, they left them there as a warning for everybody else. And God's people are not to be like that. If this is the execution and this happens, he's already under a curse. Get the body down and bury it. Right? And don't defile it. Okay. Chapter 22, the first 12 verses have a lot to do with, actually the first 4 or 5 verses really have a lot to do with Israel living as a group of people, living in community. Right? You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray and ignore them. Take them back to your brother. And if he does not live near you, you don't know who he is, you'll bring it home to your house and it will stay with you until your brother seeks it. Then you'll restore it to him. You'll do the same with his donkey or with his garment or with any lost thing of your brother which he loses and you find. You may not ignore it. You will not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen down by the way and ignore them. You'll help him to lift them up again. I hope that this kind of conveys what Israel is supposed to be as far as people of integrity and people they can trust. We're going to move into a new nation. Actually, right now, they've been traveling together for 40-some years as a nation. They're going to move into this new land that God's going to give them. It's no excuse to forget who you are and that you're a part of a group of people. If you see this happening, you can't turn a blind eye to it. You help. There's actually another spot, and I can't remember if it's on into Deuteronomy or if it's back in Exodus in the Book of the Covenant, where even if it's your enemy, if it's your enemy's ox or his donkey, you don't leave them. You help. They've got to be able to trust one another. They have to be able to understand that I'm looking out for you and you're looking out for me. Right? This is not finders keepers. Right? You're going to take care of it until he gets back. Now, we get into some other, these are some, the heading in my Bible says various laws, and there's some that'll be called miscellaneous laws, but I think there's some good stuff here. A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. Most of the commentaries I've looked at, this has to do with transvestites. Right? That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen in Israel. Here's another one that there's about 3 in here that I find kind of odd. If you come across a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with the young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You let the mother go, but the young you can take for yourself, that it may go well with you and you may live long. Again, I think we see God's care for his creation, to be responsible to what's happening around there. I wonder sometimes, and again, I've got to tell you, I don't fully get these, right? But I'm wondering, you let the mother go and you take the young, because the mother will produce more, right? But if you take all of them, then you lose the whole thing, Right? You take mother and young. If you take the mother, the young or the eggs are not going to survive. If you take all of them, it's the same difference. They all are wiped out. Or you can take the young, but you leave the mother. And I don't know whether this is related to it. The other really odd commandment that I think is an odd commandment about boiling a young goat in its mother's milk. I wonder if those two are related somehow or another. But anyway, that's another one. Here's another one about making sure that you're looking out for your neighbor. You build a new house, you make a parapet on your roof so that you may not bring the guilt of blood upon your house if anybody falls from it. And here's the ones I have trouble with, and it's probably just me, just because I just don't get it, right? You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest the whole yield be forfeited, the crop that you have sown and the yield of the vineyard. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together, and you shall not wear cloth of wool and linen mixed together. I don't want anybody checking my tags. It could be I've got some kind of blend that I'm not supposed to have. Now, here's the deal. Here's what I think, right? And that's what we're getting. A lot of this is what we think, because it's really difficult for us to. This seems to make sense to them, right? We don't get a big explanation of why. It's just don't do this, and so it may make sense to them, and maybe it doesn't. But this is what God's asking them to do. I think this has to do with Israel being holy. If you go back a little ways, I know that it's back in the same things we've already covered, and I know it's coming up again, that they are not to intermarry with the nations around them. Right? Israel is to be a separate and distinct people. Israel is referred to, not necessarily here, but will be referred to later on by God as their vineyard. And there's not two kinds of seed in the vineyard. Right? It's one. It doesn't want it mixed. The ox and the donkey make a little bit more sense just thinking through it, because they're not equal. Right? They're not equal in strength. So it would be difficult, right, to put an ox and a donkey together and actually get done what you could get done if you paired them up the other way. The other thing is that, and I came across this, was that an ox is considered a clean animal, a donkey's not. And those don't get put together. Right? And the same thing when it comes to the clothing. That there's a oneness. I did run across this. I ran across it kind of late, so I didn't go back and look at all of it. But one of the commentaries that I read about the clothing said that you have the Israelites are not supposed to mix wool and linen, because that's the garments of the priest. Only the priest can do that. I know that the priests have linen undergarments, right? And I believe the shroud, the turban is linen, but the others may be wool and scarlet fabric woven together. So they could do that. But it does call for them to be different. We're out of time, so we're not going to get to the fun stuff, but we'll get to that next week. Well, we're all looking forward to laws concerning sexual immorality. We'll get to them next week. But I do hope that the one thing that keeps coming to mind as we read through this is this idea of being different. Israel doesn't conduct warfare like the other nations. They don't treat captives like the other nations. They don't siege cities like other nations. Right? They don't mix in other nations, because God's called them to be holy, different. I don't want us to get the idea that we're not supposed to have contact with the pagans. Okay? I think that's pretty clear in other places in Scripture. Jesus talking to his followers says, if that were the case, you'd have to take them out of the world. So they're going to be in the world, not of the world. But that our conduct, the way we live together as community, the way that we live individually is different from the nations around us, whatever that nation may be. And all of that difference is to point to the one who redeemed us. That we're to be different because of who he is. And we're to call others to join in to be different with us. All right? That's all I've got for this morning, and I think we are out of time. Let's have a prayer as we're dismissed. Father, thank you so much for the time we have together. We're so thankful for your love and your care for your creation, for us. Father, we're mindful of the call to join you in the work that you have for us, to join you in your work and your purpose. Help us to not be fearful, but to lean into you, to understand that you have us. And with us on your side, there's nothing that can defeat us. Father, help us to continue to be your people, called out, not to be swayed by the nations around, but to be your people and to pursue you wholeheartedly so that we can point others to you, the one who loves and the one who redeems and the one who sets us free. Thank you, Father, so much for our time together this morning. We love you so much. In Jesus' name.